Hello guys, welcome back to Not Just Mecha. It's Marco here, and today we speed paint in high quality a color gang from Necromunda. Actually, starting from this video, I'm going to paint every single Necromunda warband. The recent trailer for the upcoming Ash Waste expansion rekindled my artistic interest for the grimdark future, and I cannot wait to paint some 40k Fremen and see all the colorful gangs and different styles next to each other on the table. Let me know in the comments which warband you want to see next.
The plan here is to take some distance from the classic grimdark tropes, and still maintaining the general gritty mood of the setting, explore the more synthwave, 80s pop sensibility of the Underhive. Of course, keeping the whole work inside my usual time frame of 4 hours. I've built my color scheme with the box art as reference, but using red to break the monotony of all the original brown and grey. I set the gang in a warm, rusty environment, but lit by a diffused, artificial, cold light, to create an interesting contrast between lights and shadows, and to take a cold step away from the extremely warm tones that I'm going to use for the fiery subfaction of the Redemptionists. These tiny models are packed with details, so the weathering is very controlled, mostly functional, and used as a way to create textures and increase the light definition on the soft edges of the fabric.
Don't forget to drop a like to help the diffusion of this video and the channel, and of course subscribe to join my painting journey in every corner of the hobby. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page, where you can find articles, extra material, and the real-time footage of my videos, with every single little line and brushstroke. Thanks a million, guys!
For this project, I'm going to use my new take on value sketching that I first used a few weeks ago on the huge dragon in the video up here. It started as a way to quickly fix, at the same time, powerful tones and contrasts on really big volumes, but I believe that the process has a lot of potential on every scale. I start the chromatic climb with a heavy zenithal coat of a dark neutral brown. The idea is to build the next layers over this natural underpainting that will passively tone down the brighter and more saturated tones, integrating all the colors into a cohesive rusty mode. You can totally save time skipping black and priming directly with the dark brown. But here I'm still not sure about how many layers I can physically overlap on these small volumes, and the amount of contrast I can obtain in the end. So I use every possible free value jump I can get. And I immediately fix the silver base for the true metallic metals. What makes this super quick, sprayed layering work is the idea that every new application is there also to fix the imperfections and the overspray of the previous ones. So I will use the tones that are more difficult to direct and control in the initial stages. And since containing the rebounds of metallic flakes is almost impossible, silver is the obvious choice for the very first layer. I fix only the heaviest overspray with a quick opaque coat of the initial brown. Blue is the main color of the scheme, the most diffused, and what defines the heraldry of the warband. So I start blocking the major sections of the outfits, to see if I like its placement and proportions. I have planned at least 2 value jumps, probably more if I can successfully handle the small volumes, so I start from a fairly dark blue. I know you'll ask in the comments, so yeah, I'm using undiluted Molotov paints, my usual 0.2 needle, and my usual high pressure of 2.7 3 bar. All the control comes from the trigger, and the relative distance from the model. To avoid losing sight of the general progression of the lights, I work with a single value jump at the time for every major color. So before moving to lighter and lighter blue tones, I define my first step into the red parts with a lighter reddish brown. Following this same idea, and based on the fact that the overspray of lighter tones is usually more visible and unforgiving, I fix a couple of layers on the few areas of visible naked skin and all the candles. I use a yellow beige as a warm foundation coming out from the warm brown underpainting. And a colder, lighter sand tone as a simple, rough highlight. Working on wraps and bandages, I overestimated the size of the targets, and I have underestimated the complexity of their angles and positions. So to prime these elements, I have to drop the airbrush and switch to the brush. I want to point out that I'm stretching the use of the airbrush to its limits because, yeah, it's super quick, but mostly because I want to maintain the information of the previous layers as much as possible, using semi-opaque or semi-transparent applications. But on these micro details, the visual loss is minimal. So even if it feels like a defeat, I'm not too worried. I move again to the blue parts of the scheme with a jump into lighter and more saturated territories. That defines the initial stage of the rendering of the fake volumes, and at the same time fixes the light overspray of the skin tones. Then pure red to match the increasing values of the other parts. Again, this choice is dictated both by the properties of this paint, that's opaque enough to fix the little imperfections of the rougher previous layers, and by the fact that I personally find it easier to spray, and finally control inside the small borders of these increasingly tinier surfaces. Sometimes the simple fact that you really like a color or its behavior is a reason solid enough to build or change an entire workflow. Back to the blue, with few extremely localized zenithal puffs of an extremely light sky blue. And I close the red progression with a strong jump into a light desaturated and colder skin tone. This step wasn't part of the original plan, but to keep the general values inside a more coherent flow, I feel the need of a touch of pure white on the highest blue elements. This first block of operations was all about the simplest rendering of the local colors of outfits and equipment, and about the shape and the fake size of the volumes they cover. I consider it as a proper value sketch, but with the advantage of an early understanding of the scheme and its intrinsic progression into neutral lights and shades, and with a very useful general sharpness that let me save a ton of time for the palette stage. But as for any proper value sketch, I don't have the real, full potential of these colors. And even more important for me, I don't have most of the environmental information coming from the setting and all its visual richness. Luckily, inks can easily and quickly fix this problem. With a transparent application of magenta, I bring back the saturation of the red elements of the scheme. This ambiguous tone delivers colder, pink sensations when overlapped to the highlights, but it becomes incredibly warm when it meets the red and browns of the shadows, setting in a single pass the idea of cold light cast over an environment with an intrinsic warm palette. I reinforce this idea with a coat of super transparent fluorescent blue that I let freely move as overspray on all the angles facing upwards. This color is naturally extremely translucent, so perfect for this kind of delicate applications, and to finely control temperature and mood. The warmer and more vibrant sensations of the darker blue shadows come from turquoise, and its subtle content of green, and, as an extension, yellow. And with this bridge in place, I can even use proper pure yellow to push on the warm visual output of the shadows. And that's the real beauty of working with transparency effects and optical mixes. This yellow from below changes not only the nature of blue and turquoise, but it also brings back magenta to the red slice of the color wheel, introducing a ton of chromatic complexity in a very short range, and with a super simple and quick application. Plus, even if it's a light tone in the bottle, when overlapped to pre-existing shadows, it makes them deeper and deeper, because even with all the translucency, it's still an extra physical layer of pigments, blocking the luminosity of the existing layers underneath. Following the logic of this progression and its environmental nature, I close this stage with a yellowish brown that, thanks to all the previous bridging of tones, can be easily used as a unifying shadow for every single color of the scheme. The virtual, cold, artificial light from the ceilings hits the warriors and the warm palette of the surroundings, bringing back in its bouncing those new sensations. It's not a case that I'm using this same color to turn the silver of the bases into an old rusty brown. And I block and unify all the different finishes of all the different brands and types of paint under a thin coat of matte varnish. All this airbrushing can cut a ton of working time, but sadly sprayed paint will never give you any real kind of definition. Maybe it's not technically true, and they are obviously part of the same organ, with the same function, but for professional deformation, and because this approach is extremely efficient. In my mind there is dark definition and light definition. And if I'm in a hurry, I like to quickly set my dark definition with oil paints. Nothing super complicated here, and all the motivations of this choice of tones and their mix are contained in the previous steps of the work. I'm setting the sharpest and the deepest shadows of the scheme, so they naturally must be dark, warm, and with a clear brownish nature. That passively adds also the idea of dirt and filth that can be really useful on these guys. Let's call it a dark burgundy. Here I just want to catch the small details and borders, so my mix is quite fluid, to flow away from the flat areas, enter by capillarity into the details, and accumulate in there. And I also try to be selective in the application, part to save time, and part to avoid altering too much the raised elements that don't need the warm wash because they need to express colder hues. When I finish the 10th model, the first one is ready to be cleaned, without any extra waiting time. And since I don't need any extra shades or blends, but I just want the super sharp rendering of the smallest details, I clean with an aggressive single pass, using Q-tips and white spirit, in a tangent motion, to leave a tiny bit of paint only inside the smaller elements. Again, I don't want to hide my work under a crust of weathering, and I've cleaned every surface extremely well to keep only the sharpest automatic lines. So the only special effect I use here is this engine grease oil paint. I went for a super matte finish everywhere, but weapons and bases will have a nice wet greasy effect inside their panel lines. It will be subtle, but easily visible in person, in the clear simplicity of the two finishes, and quite realistic. Time for light definition. To remain faithful to the theme of powerful pop culture tones, and to the effect of the solid matte finish against metals and grease, today I use only acrylic gouache for the brushwork. The more I dig into the theoretical side of this stuff, the more my palette becomes similar to that of oil painters. I have a warm and a cold saturated yellow, a warmer and a colder red, a warm and a cold light blue, plus a primary mid-value blue to bridge their high luminosities, again 2 temperatures for skin and candles, and black and white. The idea is to cover the needs of the different contrasting temperatures of the scheme, with a palette that has 2 possible options for every major tone. that can be used in different parts to boost the contrast and the natural movement of the different lights, with simple, intuitive mixes, or a direct use. In this video more than any other, I regret the fact that the timing of the single stages is not clear and distorted by the explanations. Because it's kind of an experimental take on value sketching, still in development, I have much more stuff to say about the reasons behind every little choice. But in the practical work on these small volumes, that took just a little more than 1 hour. The flow is so efficient that it's completely changing the proportions of the different stages of my work, and it's leaving me with a ton of time to work with palette and brush on the fine details. Frankly, the funniest part of the work. So, even with the self-imposed limit of the single speed painting session, I can deliver a pretty good level of fine details. Or, if you want to see it from the other perspective, if you are really in a hurry, you can totally get a decent squad in a couple of hours, and be ready for any unexpected last-minute event. These guys don't have armors, complex equipment, or any real hard edge. So, creating definition, I have complete freedom, and I can go crazy with cuts, tears, and random drawn textures of rough, old, dirty fabric. We are so used to busy models and to just paint what is actually sculpted, that this lack of borders and hard edges can become scary or confusing. But remember that you are always painting materials with some kind of relation with the real world. And if you don't know how to fill the empty space, you can always find references of the real stuff, or a close analog, and copy that fill. I close the work painting a few hard edges, polished by use and friction on metal corridors, with shiny mid-value metallic paint. And here is the final result. Few hours of work for a satisfying, high-quality skirmish gaming level that, because of all the time this flow gives me to add details and cool stuff, doesn't leave me with any artistic regret. Working on gaming stuff, this happens to me all the time, so I'm glad I found an option able to mitigate the pain. This approach, applied to big creatures and monsters, is super simple and extremely forgiving, still giving you an interesting challenge in planning and color theory. But it's a lot more skill-intensive in this kind of scale, where a steady hand and a good control of the airbrush has more impact on the final quality. So, a great exercise to boost your skills. As always, this stuff is kind of aspirational, made to show you what you can do with different tools or stretching the tools you have to their top potential. So take it more as a challenge than a linear tutorial to follow. Again, let me know in the comments which warband you want to see next.
If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!